April 1946. The war had ended months ago, yet the echoes of commands, signatures, and stamped orders still haunted the stone halls of Nuremberg. Outside, the city was a skeleton. Buildings half razed, streets scarred by tank treads, and smoke lingering faintly in the early morning mist. Inside the high-security prison, time moved differently. Here there were no parades, no salutes, no banners of victory or defeat, only the suffocating presence of guilt. Among the prisoners held in a narrow, dimly lit corridor stood Wilhelm Keitel, Field Marshal of the German High Command, a man whose very signature had authorized death. To his soldiers he had been Papa Keitel, a figure of paternal authority and unflinching loyalty. To the families of those executed, he had been the hand that signed doom. And now, as the world outside struggled to rebuild, Keitel faced the rarest of truths. Obedience carried a price, and the bills had finally come due. He was not marched into the tribunal with fanfare. No soldiers saluted. No banners proclaimed his victories. Instead, the guards' boots echoed hollowly against the cold tiles. The weight of each step seemed to press down on the man, a physical reminder of every order he had ever signed. And in that silence, Wilhelm Keitel's mind wandered back, to the faces of men who had trusted him, to the civilians whose lives were extinguished because he could not say no. The prison cell itself seemed designed to strip him of dignity. A single narrow bed pressed against the wall, a metal bucket for the most basic of needs, and a window too high to see anything but the sky, grey, overcast, heavy with rain that seemed as reluctant as the world itself to continue. He sat, hands trembling slightly, not from cold but from the weight of history itself. His medals lay on a small wooden table, dust gathering over bronze and silver, symbols of loyalty and achievement now rendered meaningless by the moral abyss they represented. Keitel's eyes, once sharp and commanding, now flickered with the uncertainty of a man confronting a truth he had never allowed himself to face: the difference between duty and conscience. The orders he had executed, the killings he had approved, the wars he had prolonged, each now a ghost haunting him in the quiet corners of his cell. He was not defiant. There was no swagger, no attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. There was only a man, human, frail, and broken, under the weight of obedience. In those long, silent hours, Keitel wrote letters, not to historians, not to posterity, but to those who remained in his life, his wife, his children, those who had never been asked to carry the burden of a nation's cruelty. He spoke of duty, of service, of loyalty, but even in the simplest words a tremor of fear seeped through, unmasking the man behind the uniform. Outside, the wind rattled the barred window, a sound as mournful as the thousands who had perished under his command. The prison guards watched from the corridor, unsure what to make of the trembling figure before them. Here was a man who had wielded the power to command death, yet now he could not command even his own courage. Each step he would take toward the tribunal would be a journey through memory, through the faces of the dead, through the orders he had given without question. And for the first time, history had become personal. The morning passed slowly. Every sound, the scrape of boots, the creak of cell doors, the distant murmur of the tribunal staff, seemed amplified within the stone walls. Keitel's thoughts twisted and turned, circling the faces of soldiers who had looked to him for guidance, civilians who had trusted their safety to his judgment, and the echoes of his own signature across countless orders of execution. Obedience had been his shield, and now it felt like chains. He rose from the narrow bed, moving with the stiffness of a man whose body had long forgotten ease. Each step toward the small basin in the corner was deliberate, careful, a ritual to distract from the avalanche of memory pressing at his mind. He washed his face slowly, water dripping onto the cold stone floor, blurring the reflection of the man he had been. The eyes staring back at him were familiar, yet strange, eyes that had once commanded respect, fear, and unwavering loyalty, now shadowed by doubt and anticipation of the inevitable. The guards entered briefly, their presence more a reminder than an intrusion. They said little, only noting the time, whispering among themselves about the day ahead. Keitel did not speak. Words had always been a tool, a weapon, a form of authority. Now they were useless. He could not order, could not command, could not excuse the weight of lives lost. Even his famous moniker, Papa Keitel, seemed a hollow echo in the cold grey morning. Sitting again at the small wooden table, he opened his leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with neat script, letters to his wife, explanations of duty, half-formed apologies that stumbled into silence. He wrote not for absolution but for understanding, not for the world but for himself. And yet, every word felt inadequate, each sentence a mirror reflecting the enormity of his actions. Could obedience ever be a defense? Could loyalty justify the blood that stained the continent? Hours passed in this manner, a slow stretching of time that felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. The shadows shifted with the sun, light pooling in uneven patches across the floor. Outside, distant bells tolled, reminders of a world attempting to move on. Inside, Keitel remained anchored to the past, suspended between the man he had been and the man he would become in the eyes of history. Finally, the time came to move. The guards called for him, their voices carrying a weight that no punishment could convey. As he rose, he paused, glancing once at the medals on the table, then at the notebook. These relics of obedience, the tangible marks of a lifetime following orders, would remain silent witnesses to the man's final hours. Keitel did not speak to the guards. He did not protest. He only walked, each step a measure of reckoning, each breath a reminder that history now demanded its toll. The corridor leading to the tribunal was narrow, claustrophobic, lined with walls that had witnessed countless human dramas, judgments and confessions. Here Wilhelm Keitel would no longer be the Field Marshal, the signer of orders, the face of power. Here he would be a man confronting the consequences of absolute obedience. Each footfall echoed against the stone, a metronome counting down to inevitability. He was no longer commanding. He was waiting. Inside, the tribunal room awaited, austere, formal, unyielding. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, highlighting the dust in the air, a visual reminder that even in the brightest light, the past could not be erased. Keitel's mind, however, was not on the room, nor the judges, nor the words that would condemn him. He thought only of what obedience had demanded of him, of how a man could erase conscience beneath the weight of duty, and of whether, in the final moments, even a soldier could reclaim his humanity. The courtroom smelled of dust, sweat, and polished wood, a mixture that seemed to swallow all hope before the trial even began. Wilhelm Keitel entered slowly, his uniform immaculate but creased from long hours of waiting. For every medal, every insignia on his chest now felt like a weight pressing down upon his shoulders, rather than a mark of honor. He was no longer Papa Keitel, the commander who had inspired obedience. He was simply a man, frail, aging, confronted by a world he had helped shatter. The judges took their seats, faces carved in stone, eyes like shutters that allowed nothing of emotion to escape. Their pens poised above papers, their silence deafening. Keitel's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, almost hesitant. "I was a soldier. I only obeyed the Führer's commands." A sentence so simple, yet it carried the weight of thousands of lives extinguished at his signature. The words trembled, not with fear, but with the realization that obedience, once a shield, could not now protect him from judgment. He had lived a life of orders and submission, of marching and signing, of conformity and denial. And now every action, every signature, every salute returned to him like echoes from a dark abyss. The prosecution laid out the evidence meticulously, lists of names, execution orders, photographs of massacres, witness testimonies. Each document was a shard of morality shattered, each photograph a mirror reflecting the consequences of unquestioned obedience. Keitel's hands, once steady as he directed armies, now shook as he adjusted his glasses, traced lines on the papers, and tried, futilely, to find a justification that would satisfy not only the court, but his own conscience. Silence hovered in the room between words, broken only by the scratching of pens and the occasional cough from a clerk. Every so often a juror would glance toward Keitel, and he would meet their gaze with a hollow calm. His eyes betrayed a lifetime of conflict. The man who had executed orders without hesitation now faced the impossibility of explaining why those orders were followed. Could duty ever be a moral excuse? Could loyalty ever override conscience? These questions, once theoretical, now consumed him. Outside the courtroom, the world continued. Children laughed in distant streets, newspapers recounted reconstruction efforts, and life moved on as if the horrors of the past had been neatly sealed away. Inside, time moved differently. Each second stretched, pulled taut by the gravity of moral reckoning. Keitel thought of the soldiers who had trusted him, the civilians who had perished, the faces of families torn apart. He had been a cog in a machine of obedience, but now, for the first time, he felt the weight of the human cost pressing upon him directly, with no uniform, no rank, no power to shield him. During breaks, he would retreat to a corner of the room, hands clasped tightly together. Sometimes he pressed them to his mouth, swallowing words he could not form. At other moments, he would stare blankly at the ceiling, seeing visions of towns burned, of people marching toward death, of signatures flowing across paper like rivers of ink and blood. He had believed that following orders absolved him. Now he understood that it could not. Obedience without conscience was not honor. It was the slow erosion of humanity itself. And yet, even as he faced this trial, a cruel irony gnawed at him. For decades he had dictated orders that ended men's lives instantly, leaving them no chance to explain, to beg, or to reason. Now the court demanded an explanation not from a soldier, but from a human being burdened by the consequences of his own adherence to command. His final words would not be commands. They would be pleas, faint, fragile, human. The court session stretched into the afternoon. Every statement, every objection, every question felt like a probe into the core of his morality. Keitel's voice often faltered. He wiped tears that had no audience, save for the cold eyes of history watching. Every trembling gesture, every quiet sigh spoke more loudly than any defense lawyer could articulate. Obedience had been his creed. Now vulnerability was his only truth. He thought of the irony. Men who had marched to his orders had perished without complaint. And yet here he was, the wielder of authority, rendered powerless by the moral weight of the lives he had touched and destroyed. The courtroom became both a stage and a confessional. Each word, each pause, each breath was scrutinized. History itself seemed to lean forward, eager to mark the final judgment on a man who had spent a lifetime executing the will of another. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the polished floor, Keitel sat in silence. The verdict loomed like a shadow of the noose he would soon face. Every signature he had penned, every command he had issued, every oath he had taken now converged upon him. And in that silence a single truth emerged. The man who had given death so easily would now beg not for others but for himself, though even the most fervent plea could not undo the past. The trial resumed the next morning with the same cold precision. The courtroom was quieter now, as if even the walls anticipated the inevitable. Wilhelm Keitel sat rigidly, his uniform impeccable, but his mind was a battlefield far fiercer than any he had commanded in war. Every witness, every document, every whispered recollection of the horrors he had sanctioned pressed against him like invisible hands, tugging at the fragile threads of his composure. "I obeyed orders," he murmured to himself, almost involuntarily, as if repeating a mantra might shield him from the weight of guilt. He remembered signing the lists, sending men to their deaths with a single stroke of a pen. He remembered the faces of those who trusted him, the soldiers who would never see home again. And now he was forced to confront the truth he had evaded for decades. Obedience, without conscience, is a prison more confining than any cell. The prosecutor stood, voice sharp and deliberate, recounting massacre after massacre, execution after execution. The words were not merely accusations. They were echoes of the lives extinguished under Keitel's signature. For the first time he realized that the ink he had once seen as a duty, as loyalty, now symbolized rivers of human suffering. His hands, once steady as he marshaled armies, now trembled uncontrollably. He wiped at his eyes, attempting to stem the tears, but the act felt meaningless. The court's silence pressed upon him, heavy as stone, indifferent to any display of remorse or explanation. During a recess, he retreated to a quiet corner of the courtroom, eyes fixed on a crack in the floor. Images of the past swirled in his mind. Villages burned, civilians rounded up, soldiers executing orders without hesitation. He had been the orchestrator of compliance, the man whose signature carried the authority of life and death. And yet, stripped of rank and surrounded by judges and witnesses, he felt powerless. The realization was suffocating. All his authority, all his loyalty, all his obedience had led only to this moment of vulnerability and exposure. He reflected bitterly on the irony. For decades he had watched men die instantly upon his commands, their pleas silenced, their fear extinguished. And now he faced a tribunal that demanded a human explanation, an emotional reckoning, a plea that could never truly undo the consequences of his obedience. The moral weight was unbearable, crushing every remnant of pride, leaving only raw human fragility. As the afternoon sun filtered through the high windows, casting elongated shadows across the polished floors, Catel's mind wandered further. He thought of his men, those who had trusted him unquestioningly, and wondered how many would have survived if he had paused, if he had hesitated, if he had chosen conscience over blind obedience. But such thoughts were not solace. They were knives twisting deeper, reminders that opportunity had been lost, that lives had been irreversibly claimed under his pen. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense as the final arguments approached. The judge's gavel, when it fell, resonated like a heartbeat in the quiet room. Catel's lips moved, whispering prayers he had never learned, seeking forgiveness he feared could never come. His signature had once dictated the rhythm of life and death. Now it trembled on paper before a tribunal that demanded truth, accountability, and above all humanity. And then came the verdict, inevitable, unwavering. Guilty, a word heavier than any artillery shell, louder than the roar of any battlefield. Catel's breath hitched. The judges, unmoved, began reading the sentence, death by hanging. A silence fell over the courtroom, so complete it seemed as though the world itself held its breath. He understood the cruel poetry of it. The man who had once executed others instantly would now wait, experience fear, plead silently, and feel the inexorable approach of mortality, inch by agonizing inch. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine the past, the orders, the power, the certainty, and then he let it go as one lets fall a lifeless weight. He was no longer a commander. He was simply a man, facing the consequences of a lifetime spent obeying rather than judging, following rather than questioning. The final irony was stark. The pen that had signed death orders now trembled in memory alone, powerless to alter a fate meticulously crafted by obedience. April 15, 1946. The cell was small, its walls grey and unyielding, echoing every sound of dripping water and distant footsteps. Wilhelm Keitel sat hunched over a rough wooden desk, a single candle flickering beside him, casting long, trembling shadows across the damp floor. The war was over, the Third Reich destroyed, yet the orders he had signed still haunted him, like ghostly ink etched onto his conscience. He reached for a sheet of paper, the pen cold in his fingers, and began to write. Not for the world, not for the judges, but for the family he feared he might never see again. He addressed his letters to his wife and children with the precision of a soldier, yet the tremor in his hands betrayed a heart far from disciplined. Each word was weighed, chosen to preserve a fragment of dignity, a sliver of humanity in the shadow of the monstrous legacy he carried. "Remember me as a soldier," he wrote, "not as a monster. I have followed orders, always, and yet I have seen what obedience costs." His words were not mere excuses. They were confessions of a man coming face to face with the magnitude of his choices. Outside, the rain lashed against the barred windows. The wind whistled through cracks in the stone walls, creating a mournful chorus that seemed to echo every command Keitel had ever given. Inside, he folded the letter with meticulous care, placing it on the edge of the desk. The candlelight illuminated his face, aged, weary, and lined with a lifetime of authority now stripped bare. A man who had once stood beside Hitler, who had commanded armies with a signature, now sat trembling, praying for forgiveness he feared could never come. The prison priest, a quiet man with kind eyes, entered the cell. Keitel's gaze lifted, searching for absolution in the small, unassuming figure. "Is there forgiveness for a man who has only obeyed?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. His uniform, immaculate for decades, now seemed a weightless relic, powerless to shield him from the enormity of his deeds. The priest's voice was calm but piercing. "Obedience without conscience is the seed of every war." The words sank into him like stones thrown into a deep, dark well, their ripples touching every corner of his mind. Keitel's thoughts spiraled back to moments he had long buried. The battlefield decisions, the execution lists, the towns reduced to rubble. He remembered faces, soldiers, civilians, children, all swallowed by the machinery of obedience he had operated. Each memory was a blade, cutting deeper than any physical wound he had endured. The ink of his pen now seemed insufficient to record the enormity of his guilt. Yet he continued, writing letters as if the act itself could somehow cleanse him. or at least delay the judgment that awaited him at dawn. Tears came then, unbidden, falling freely onto the paper. He had never cried openly in front of men. He had never trembled in the presence of soldiers or judges. But here, alone with his conscience, the weight of a lifetime of orders given, lives lost, collapsed him. He wept not for himself, but for the humanity he had abandoned in the name of duty. For the first time, the facade of the unflinching Field Marshal cracked completely. The candle flickered again, shadows dancing across the walls like ghostly spectres of those whose lives had ended by his signature. Keitel paused, hand frozen above the paper, thinking of the rope, the gallows, the inevitability of the morning. His letters were not just messages to loved ones. They were a plea to history itself, a silent acknowledgement of the monstrous consequences of blind obedience. Each word was a tremor in the stillness of the cell, a heartbeat of remorse, a whisper to the past. I have failed. I was human, and yet complicit. As the night deepened, silence wrapped around the Nuremberg cell like a suffocating shroud. Keitel lay on the narrow cot for a few restless moments, staring at the cracked ceiling, the shadows twisting like the countless faces of those who had died under his orders. He could hear the faint drip of water in the corner, each drop a ticking clock counting down to dawn, to the final reckoning. Sleep refused him, and in its place came memories vivid and unforgiving. He recalled signing death orders without hesitation, the authority of the signature once a shield against conscience. The weight of each command now pressed down like iron chains. Each moment of obedience, once justified as duty, now felt like a betrayal of morality, of the very humanity he had taken for granted. He traced each memory with trembling fingers, as though touching the past could somehow soothe it. But it did not. Keitel rose from the cot and paced the cell. His uniform, once crisp and proud, now felt like a costume, a reminder of the man he had been and the man he had become. He passed the candlelight over the letters he had written, each fold a silent confession, each sentence an appeal for understanding he feared would never come. Outside, the wind carried the mournful sound of distant church bells, tolling like a funeral dirge for the world that had been destroyed by obedience without conscience. At one point, he knelt beside the desk, clasping his hands in prayer. God, he whispered, voice breaking, if you hear me, I followed orders. I obeyed, and now I face the cost. Is there forgiveness for a man like me? The priest, who had remained in the cell quietly, nodded solemnly. Forgiveness is for those who seek it with conscience, Wilhelm. But conscience is not always found in orders. It is forged in choice. Keitel pressed his forehead to the wooden desk, tears staining the paper, heart pounding with the realization that all his choices had been stripped by obedience. Hours passed. The candle burned low, and with it, the last fragments of denial. Keitel reflected on the irony. The man who had orchestrated death from the comfort of command was now powerless before mortality. He thought of his family who might never see him again. The letters, carefully folded, were the only bridge to a world he had abandoned, a world that no longer needed the soldier, only the man who had failed. He thought of history, of the inked signature that had sealed countless fates. Would it remember him as a soldier, or as a man who had abdicated morality? The question haunted him more than the noose awaiting him at dawn. Each breath was heavy, each heartbeat a reminder of the life he had led and the judgment he could not escape. By the first light of dawn, Keitel had dressed meticulously in his uniform. He combed his hair with deliberate precision, adjusted his medals, and stood before the small mirror in the cell. The reflection was almost unrecognizable, the confident Field Marshal replaced by a frail, trembling man, eyes hollow with realization. Yet beneath the fear there remained a trace of pride, not for his deeds, but for having confronted them without illusion. He collected the letters, placed them carefully in an envelope, and handed them to the priest. "For my family," he said softly. "They must know I was still human, at least in the end." Then he knelt in silent prayer, waiting for the guards to arrive. The air was thick with tension, every footstep echoing like a drumbeat toward inevitability. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of the prison corridor, painting long pale stripes across the cold stone floor. Wilhelm Keitel was awake before the guards came for him. Each breath was deliberate, each step measured, as if the air itself carried the weight of every order he had signed. every life extinguished by his signature. Outside the world stirred, birds called softly, unaware that history's witness was moments away from sealing his own fate. Keitel's uniform had been pressed the night before, medals polished to catch the faintest glimmer of morning light, but no shine could mask the trembling that had settled deep in his bones. He walked slowly to the chamber door, flanked by 2 silent guards, their faces as unreadable as the stone walls themselves. The rope hung like a quiet judge in the center of the execution room, casting a shadow that stretched across the floor, as if waiting for him to step into history's embrace. Every step echoed, hollow and unyielding. Keitel tried to straighten his back, to hold the dignity of a soldier he had long believed himself to be. Yet the reality of the situation pressed down on him, harder than any battlefield ever had. His mind wandered back to the millions of lives he had touched with a pen rather than a sword. Orders carried out without question, obedience made absolute. The irony now cut sharper than any battlefield wound. The man who had dictated death would face it silently, unarmed, powerless. The chamber was cold, the air heavy with the scent of damp stone and distant smoke from the morning fog outside. Keitel's hands, once so steady while signing execution lists, now shook as the rope was adjusted around his neck. He felt the coarse fibers press against his skin, the final reminder of mortality waiting patiently for him. "I ask God for mercy on the German people," he whispered, voice breaking, the weight of history and guilt crystallizing in that single plea. The executioner, a shadowed figure in black, moved with practiced efficiency. No emotion, no hesitation. He had seen men fall in fear, in courage, in defiance. But perhaps he could sense something different in Keitel, a man broken not by weapons, not by circumstance, but by the realization of the magnitude of his own obedience. Keitel's eyes closed briefly, a silent prayer escaping his lips, a farewell to the world that had both elevated and condemned him. The lever was pulled. Time seemed to stretch. The rope tightened, the thud echoed, and then silence. Silence heavier than any battlefield, colder than any winter dawn. The man who had given death its orders was gone, leaving behind only the hollow echo of his name, a legacy bound in obedience, compliance, and tragedy. The rope tightened around Wilhelm Keitel's neck, coarse fibers biting into his skin. For a fleeting moment, he imagined the battlefield, the trembling soldiers, the smoke, the endless lines of men who had followed his orders without question. All those faces, all those lives, now converged in the shadow of the noose. There was no trumpet, no drums of war, only the quiet, cold air of the chamber, carrying the scent of damp stone and inevitability. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself, straightening one last time. He wanted to stand as he had on the parade grounds, as he had before the Führer himself, commanding respect and fear. But the respect was gone. The fear was now his own, and even that felt alien. For the first time, Keitel felt the crushing weight of obedience reversed back onto him. He had obeyed so many orders. Now he awaited the final command. The executioner's hand hovered over the lever, a mechanical inevitability. Keitel's eyes for a moment lifted to the ceiling, seeking absolution from a God who had watched humanity twist itself into chaos. His lips moved silently, a prayer, a confession, a last acknowledgement of mortality. Memories of those he had condemned flickered. Civilians, prisoners, soldiers. Faces blurred together into a tapestry of sorrow. And then, he remembered his own signature on the death orders. That signature had carried the weight of life and death. And now it trembled, powerless, a sudden shift in the air when the lever was pulled. Time seemed to fracture. The chamber echoed with the thud of the trapdoor giving way. Keitel dropped, the rope jerking tight. For a heartbeat, everything held suspended. The chill of the morning, the silence of stone walls, the weight of all the deaths he had once commanded. His body swung slightly, the motion slow, measured, almost serene. The shock waves of that single thud rolled through the soldiers present, a reminder of the mortal vulnerability they often overlooked. Some guards shifted uncomfortably. They had executed many, yet there was something unsettling in the finality of this act. The man who had ordered thousands to die now lay at their mercy. There was no struggle, no pleading, only the subtle quiver of a man who had understood too late that obedience could not protect him from justice. The room seemed to shrink around his still form, the rope holding not just his body, but the weight of history itself. After what felt like an eternity, the executioner stepped forward, confirming the finality. Keitel's eyes, once sharp with command, now stared blankly at the ceiling. The echoes of his signature lingered in the minds of all present, a haunting symbol of compliance, loyalty, and the moral cost of following orders blindly. Outside the chamber, the dawn broke fully, spilling cold light onto the prison yard as if the world itself exhaled, acknowledging the end of a man who had wielded death with a pen, now silenced by the rope. Wilhelm Keitel is gone. The trapdoor, the noose, the echo of the lever. All of it remains confined to the memories of those present in that cold Nuremberg morning. Yet the shadow he cast did not end with his death. History remembers him not for courage nor for defiance. It remembers him for compliance, the terrifying kind that slips unnoticed into bureaucratic papers, into signed orders, into unquestioned obedience. Keitel's signature was a simple flourish of ink on a paper, yet it carried the weight of thousands of lives. To the untrained eye, it was merely a formal validation of commands. But to those who perished, it was the final sentence. And that is where his danger lay. In the quiet power of a man who never roared, never drew a sword, never commanded a charge. His weapon was paperwork. His cruelty, adherence to protocol. In classrooms and history books, students read about battles and generals, about heroism and villainy. Yet few pause to consider the men like Keitel, who obeyed without conscience. These are the faces of banal evil, the ones who make the machinery of death function smoothly, invisibly, relentlessly. The Holocaust, the massacres, the countless executions, all of them depended on men like him. Without the roar of the battlefield, without the cries of soldiers, compliance carried the weight of morality's failure. Witnesses from the Nuremberg trials later recalled his trembling hands, his tear-streaked face, the letters he wrote to family begging for remembrance, not as a monster but as a soldier. These gestures are not excuses. They are evidence that even those who commit atrocities can feel human emotions, fear, regret, perhaps even guilt. And that duality is what history finds unnerving. It is the reminder that evil does not always wear fangs. Sometimes it wears a uniform and signs its name. Even after his execution, Keitel's presence lingered in the archives, in the papers that bore his signature, and in the memory of those who survived his orders. Scholars argue that the measure of a man's cruelty is not only in what he directly does, but in what he enables through obedience. Keitel enabled death, destruction, and chaos without raising a hand. And that perhaps makes him more dangerous than those who actively killed. To understand the legacy of Wilhelm Keitel is to confront a moral paradox, a man who obeyed, not out of hatred, not out of passion, but out of loyalty and to power, to orders, to authority. In obeying, he allowed the machinery of evil to function efficiently. In signing, he sanctioned atrocity. In saying yes, sir, he demonstrated how quiet compliance can become the loudest voice in history's tragedies. Even decades later, Keitel's name evokes the tension between loyalty and morality. Military historians study him not merely as a man, but as a symbol, the embodiment of obedience run amok. In lecture halls, his life is dissected, how a single signature could facilitate death, how bureaucracy could become a weapon. His example forces a difficult question: how many ordinary men following orders have allowed extraordinary horrors to occur? Keitel's legacy is silent yet deafening. There are no heroic tales, no battlefield glories to recount. His notoriety lies in restraint, the restraint of conscience, the restraint of human judgment, replaced entirely by duty. This is what makes his story haunting. He did not scream. He did not rage. He merely followed the chain of command, turning morality into a footnote and humanity into paperwork. In private letters, Keitel often reflected on his role. Some scholars suggest a flicker of regret, a fleeting awareness that blind obedience could never justify mass suffering. But his remorse was personal, private, contained within walls where history could not hear it. Outside, the world remembered the orders, the consequences, and the countless lives extinguished under his authorization. He became a lesson etched into the annals of post-war Europe, that evil does not always roar, sometimes it whispers bureaucratic compliance. Today, students, military officers, and historians revisit Keitel's actions to confront a chilling reality. Power amplified by obedience is more dangerous than power wielded by rage. The signature of a man like Keitel is a reminder that history's machinery often relies not on monsters, but on men who say yes when conscience demands no. And in that quiet compliance, the weight of accountability falls heaviest. Even the executions themselves, once final, once absolute, could not erase the legacy. Papers, testimonies, and photographs remain, a silent monument to a man whose most terrifying weapon was not force but acquiescence. Keitel's story serves as a stark moral. Evil does not always make noise. Sometimes it signs its name, folds its hands, and waits for others to act. In reflecting on Wilhelm Keitel, we are forced to consider the ordinary choices that shape history. A man may not draw a gun, may not strike a blow, yet still orchestrate death through obedience. That is the horror and the lesson that echoes beyond the walls of Nuremberg, that sometimes the most dangerous evil is the one that whispers compliance and calls it duty. He obeyed every order, every command, every instruction written in ink and stamped with authority, until the one that ended him. Wilhelm Keitel's life reminds us that obedience without conscience carries a weight heavier than any battlefield. History does not remember him for bravery, nor for resistance. It remembers him for compliance. It remembers how a man, once powerful enough to command death, could reduce himself to trembling before the inevitability of his own fate. We watch these stories not to glorify the guilty, but to understand the fragile line between duty and morality. To see how ordinary men, clothed in uniforms and armed with authority, can perpetuate extraordinary horrors, quietly, silently, without a shout. And when their names fade from headlines, the lessons remain. The silence of their actions speaks louder than the thunder of wars. It whispers to us, warns us, challenges us. What will we do when obedience clashes with conscience? So remember Keitel not as a man who followed orders, but as a warning of what happens when obedience eclipses humanity. And as you reflect on this, subscribe. Because every story like this, every echo of history, deserves to be remembered. Because silence, like history itself, is never truly quiet. It speaks, and it can never be ignored.